The night began with fire, not the kind that warms a home or lights a lantern, but the kind that swallows everything and leaves behind only silence and ash. Gideon Pratt saw the smoke rising from the valley just beyond the ridge, a serpent of light twisting against the deep blue of dusk, and something ancient stirred in him. He'd promised himself long ago never to cross into Apache territory again, never to let another person's ruin become his burden. But when the wind carried the faintest sound, a human cry swallowed by crackling flame, his horse was already moving before his mind caught up. He didn't believe in destiny. He believed in habits, in hard work, in silence. Yet that night felt like something written before he was born, something waiting in the darkness to wake him. The closer he rode, the clearer the glow became, until the sky itself burned. The cabin ahead was collapsing, its roof a skeleton of embers. He dismounted, covering his mouth against the smoke. And then he saw her, through the orange veil of firelight, a figure pinned beneath a fallen beam, motionless but alive. He rushed forward. The heat seared his skin. Smoke stung his eyes. She wasn't screaming, not fighting, just lying there, watching the flames curl toward her with the calm of someone who'd already made peace with dying. Gideon hesitated only for a heartbeat. She was enormous, taller than any woman he'd ever seen, built like the earth itself had sculpted her from stone. But her eyes, when they met his through the haze, weren't monstrous. They were terrified, not of death, but of something worse, life itself. That look pulled him through the fire. The beam wouldn't move. His muscles trembled, lungs filled with poison. He braced his boots against the floor and pulled with everything left in him. For a moment, nothing. Then a crack, a shift, and suddenly she was free. He dragged her out just as the roof caved in, both of them collapsing into the cold dirt. For a long time there was only the sound of breathing, ragged, desperate, alive. When she sat up, the world around them glowed with dying light. Her height was impossible, nearly 7 feet, her shoulders broad, her frame carved with strength that made his own feel small. She looked at him as though she couldn't decide if he was a threat or a ghost. The fire reflected in her dark eyes, the kind that carried centuries of grief. Gideon extended a hand. She stared at it like a weapon, refusing to touch him. Her palms were scarred, lines crossing like old roads of pain. She rose on her own, staggering but proud. Without a word, she turned away, stepping into the forest as the last embers fell. Gideon stood alone in the smoke, unsure whether he'd rescued a woman or invited a curse into his life. The night air was heavy with something that wasn't just ash, something fated, something that whispered his life would never be the same again. He didn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, those deep eyes, the scars, the quiet strength. Before dawn, his coffee boiled over on the stove, untouched. When the sound of horses reached his porch, he already knew this wasn't over. The man who approached was old, wrapped in a long coat that carried dust and dignity. Behind him, 3 younger riders watched Gideon with hands near their weapons. The old man's voice cut through the morning chill. "You saved my daughter." Not a question, but a verdict. Gideon nodded slowly. The man's expression didn't change. "Then you must marry her." For a moment, the world fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Gideon's hand froze around his coffee cup. "I don't understand," he said. The old man's name was Taza. His words came heavy, each one a stone dropped into still water. The woman's name, he said, was Nalnish, his only child, hunted by her own people for being too different. Among them, a life saved meant a bond unbreakable. The man spoke not of gratitude, but of necessity, as though Gideon had been chosen by fate, not accident. He listened, though the logic was madness. Marry her, protect her. He was a rancher, not a savior. But the way Taza spoke, calm and certain, left no room for refusal. "If you say no," he warned, "she will be dead within the week." The old man left a small leather pouch on the railing, a gesture of trade, of finality, and rode away, leaving dust and silence in his wake. Gideon stared at the pouch, but didn't open it. He already knew there was nothing inside that could buy him peace. By midday, he found himself walking through tall grass toward the creek beyond his pasture. He told himself it was curiosity, but he knew better. He needed to see her again, needed to understand the strange pull that fire had left behind. She was there, sitting on a rock by the water, her back turned to him. In daylight, she was even more striking, her skin bronze against the morning light, her dark hair falling heavy over her shoulders. Even seated, she was his height. She didn't move when he approached, but he felt her awareness, sharp, wary, alive. "Your father came to my ranch," Gideon said quietly. "He told me, you can't go home." She didn't turn, only answered with a voice deep and steady, shaped by years of silence. "He should have let me burn." The words hit him like a blow. Gideon had known despair, but never heard it spoken so plainly. "I don't believe that," he said. She turned then. Her eyes caught his, fierce and wounded all at once. "You don't know anything about me," she said, "about what I am." He looked at her scars, the weary strength in her hands. "I know you didn't start that fire. Someone wanted you dead." Her lips twitched in something close to a bitter smile. "Does it matter? They've wanted that since I was born." The truth came slowly, like confession from a wound. She told him how the shamans and healers tried to fix her, how they bound her arms, burned her skin with sacred marks, prayed to stop her bones from growing wrong. When they failed, they locked her away, calling her cursed. Her cabin had been her prison for years, until 3 nights ago, when young warriors decided the fire would cleanse their shame. Gideon listened, his chest tightening with every word. She spoke without emotion, but her voice carried the ache of someone who had long stopped expecting kindness. "You asked why your father came," Gideon said quietly. "He said, I was the only man who showed you kindness without fear." She laughed softly, a sound without joy. "My father is trying to fix his own guilt. You just happened to be standing in the right place when his shame caught fire." The wind stirred the water. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Gideon asked, "What do you want?" She blinked, startled, as if no one had ever asked her that before. "I don't know," she whispered. "I've spent so long surviving, I forgot there was more to living." Before he could answer, the ground trembled with the sound of hooves. 5 riders burst from the trees, moving fast, confident. The air shifted, danger, sharp and immediate. Nalnish stood, her body tense. "They found me," she said. Gideon stepped forward instinctively, placing himself between her and the oncoming men. He had no weapon, just the stubbornness of a man who'd lost too much to run. The leader reined in his horse 20 feet away. "Step aside, white man," he said. "This is not your concern." "She's on my land," Gideon answered. "That makes it my concern." The warrior's face twisted with disgust. He spoke in his own tongue, short, cutting syllables. Nalnish's translation was simple. He says, "I poisoned his brother. That I bring sickness just by existing." Her calmness chilled him more than the accusation. He didn't move. "You're not touching her," he said. The man dismounted slowly, drawing a knife that glinted in the sun. The others spread out. 5 armed men against 1 rancher. A hopeless equation. But before Gideon could act, Nalnish stepped forward. She didn't reach for a weapon. She simply straightened to her full height, 7 feet of quiet defiance, her presence filling the space like thunder without sound. The warriors hesitated. 2 stepped back. She spoke, voice low but resonant, in her native tongue. A challenge, not a plea. Gideon didn't understand the words, but he understood the power. The men looked at her with fear disguised as rage. For the first time, he realized she wasn't just surviving. She was refusing to die on anyone's terms. Taza arrived then, leading a dozen riders. The confrontation dissolved in tense silence as the old man forced the young warriors to retreat. But Gideon saw it in their eyes. The hate hadn't gone, only shifted into waiting. When they were gone, Taza turned to him. "You have until sunset to decide. Protect her, or she dies. After that, even I cannot stop what comes." He rode away, leaving Gideon and Nalnish by the creek, surrounded by the sound of running water and the faint scent of smoke still clinging to her hair. She sat back down, staring at the ripples. "You see now," she said softly, "why I should have burned." Gideon looked at her, at the strength that had carried her through a lifetime of cruelty, and thought how wrong she was. She wasn't a curse. She was the fire that refused to die. And he, lonely, broken, tired of ghosts, was already standing too close to the heat to walk away. If you're still here, listening, let your heart rest a moment. Some stories are meant to remind us that kindness is never weakness, that even the coldest hearts can find warmth again. If this touched you, take a breath, leave a little light in the comments, and subscribe for more healing stories like this, because sometimes all we need is one spark to remember how to feel alive again. The morning after the fire carried a strange stillness, the kind that lingers when the world has shifted in ways too subtle to name. Gideon woke before dawn, the desert air cold enough to sting his lungs. The horizon glowed pale gold, and the only sound was the rustle of dry grass swaying in the wind. He stood on his porch, staring at the creek beyond the pasture where she had vanished hours ago, her silhouette still etched behind his eyelids like a scar made of light. He told himself he was only waiting for the sun, but the truth was heavier. Something inside him, something long buried beneath years of silence, had begun to stir. He remembered the way her voice had trembled when she said he should have let her burn. Those words haunted him, not as guilt, but as recognition. He'd said the same thing to himself 1,000 times, though never out loud. Maybe that was why her despair felt so familiar. It was the same shade as his own. By mid-morning, the world had warmed, but Gideon's thoughts hadn't. The smell of smoke still clung to his clothes, mingling with the scent of coffee he hadn't finished. He tried to go about his chores, mending a fence post, checking the horses, but every creak of the wood, every gust of wind seemed to whisper her name. Nalnish. He didn't know why it mattered. She was a stranger, a woman caught in a fire he had no reason to enter, and yet the memory of her eyes kept him from finding peace. He didn't see Taza until the sun was high. The old Apache leader rode up to his porch with quiet authority, his shadow stretching long across the dry earth. He dismounted slowly, his movements measured and deliberate. Behind him, 3 younger warriors stood watching, their hands resting near their weapons, though none of them spoke. Gideon set down the bucket he'd been carrying. Taza's gaze met his, unwavering. "You saved my daughter," he said again, his tone heavy with unspoken weight. "For that my people owe you a debt, but a debt must be honored properly." He stepped closer, and the old man's next words turned Gideon's world on its side. "You must marry her." The silence that followed was suffocating. Gideon thought he had misheard, but Taza's eyes held no hint of jest. They were ancient eyes, the kind that carried the gravity of tradition stronger than any law. Gideon swallowed. "I don't understand." "You will," Taza replied. "My daughter, Nalnish, cannot return to our village. She is not safe there. Her size, her strength, they see her as a curse. There are men who would kill her to cleanse what they believe to be a sin, but among us, when one life saves another, the 2 are bound. You gave her life. Now it belongs to you to protect." Gideon's pulse hammered in his throat. "You're asking me to marry someone I don't even know." "I am asking you to give her what I cannot," Taza said. "Safety, a place in this world." His voice softened. "She has nowhere else to go." The old man removed a small pouch from his coat and placed it on the porch rail. A simple offering, wrapped in leather and tied with sinew. "If you refuse, I will not blame you. But understand this, she will die within the week. My word cannot protect her forever." Then, as quietly as he had come, Taza mounted his horse and rode away, the dust rising behind him like fading prayer smoke. Gideon stood there, staring at the pouch, feeling the air grow thick with a decision he did not want to make. He spent hours pacing the edge of his property, his thoughts tangled. The logical thing was to walk away, to let the desert reclaim what the fire had already tried to erase. But logic had died in the flames last night. Something else had taken its place, a quiet pull, strange and insistent, like gravity bending toward her. By the time the sun began its slow descent, he found himself walking toward the creek again. The tall grass brushed his legs, and the air was sweet with the scent of sage. She was there, just as he'd known she would be. Nalnish sat on a flat rock, her back to him, the light of the setting sun catching her hair like strands of bronze. She didn't turn when he approached, though he saw her shoulders tense. "Your father came to me," he said softly. "He told me what he expects." Her voice came low and tired. "He told you to marry me?" "Yes. And you came here to tell me no." He hesitated. "I don't know what I came here to say." Finally she turned, and the light hit her face in full. Her features were strong, sculpted, almost regal, but her eyes held something fragile, an exhaustion deeper than any wound. "You should say no," she said simply. "It's the only choice that makes sense." "I've made a lot of choices that didn't make sense," he murmured. She studied him, uncertain. "You don't understand what I am." "Then tell me." For a long moment she said nothing. Then, as if the truth had been waiting too long to stay buried, she spoke. "When I was born, the elders called me cursed. My mother wept when she saw me. I was too large, too strong. They tried to fix me. They burned herbs, cut my skin, whispered prayers meant to shrink what the spirits had made. The scars—" She looked down at her hands, tracing the white lines with her fingers. "They come from years of trying to make me smaller." The words hung heavy in the evening air. Gideon didn't move. He saw her not as monstrous, but as something heartbreakingly human, a soul punished for existing. "When I was old enough to work, they built me a cabin at the edge of the valley. Said it was better that I live apart, so the curse wouldn't spread. I stayed there because it was quiet. I thought solitude would keep me safe." She exhaled, her breath shaking. "Until 3 nights ago, when they decided fire was safer than my shadow." Gideon felt his chest tighten. "They tried to kill you because you were born different." She nodded once. "And because I killed a man once, accidentally." Her eyes flicked up to his, defiant but trembling. "He came to my cabin to prove I wasn't human. He attacked me. I pushed him away. He hit his head on a stone and never got up. My father hid the truth, but rumors grow like weeds. The people wanted proof that I was the curse they feared. The fire gave them that." The silence that followed was almost sacred. The creek whispered, and somewhere far off a hawk cried. Gideon felt something shift inside him, an ache that wasn't pity, but recognition. 2 lives, both exiled for reasons the world refused to understand. "You don't have to be alone anymore," he said. Nalnish's laugh was soft but empty. "You can't fix what's already been broken. You can't make me belong." "Maybe belonging isn't something people give," Gideon said quietly. "Maybe it's something we make for ourselves." She looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. The wind lifted a strand of her hair, brushing it against her cheek, and for a moment she didn't look like a giant or a curse. She just looked human, wounded, tired, and heartbreakingly alive. Then the sound of horses shattered the fragile peace. Nalnish went still. "They found me," she whispered. Gideon turned. 5 riders emerged from the tree line, faces hard, eyes fixed on her. He stepped forward without thinking. "Stay behind me," he said. "You can't fight them," she warned. "Maybe not, but I can stand." The lead warrior dismounted, his hand already on the hilt of his knife. "Step aside, white man. She's ours." Gideon's voice came low, steady. "Not anymore." The man's gaze turned sharp. "You think you can protect her? You think you understand what she is?" Gideon met his eyes without flinching. "I don't need to understand to know she doesn't deserve this." For a heartbeat, the air itself seemed to hold still. Then Nalnish stepped forward, her presence rising like thunder. She spoke in her native tongue, her voice clear, defiant. Gideon didn't understand the words, but he understood their power. The men recoiled, not from her size, but from what she represented. the living proof of everything they feared. Taza appeared then, his timing precise as fate. He rode hard from the north, followed by a dozen warriors. The young men backed down instantly under his gaze. He exchanged harsh words with them in Apache, his tone commanding and final. When they turned to leave, their eyes lingered on Nalnish with promises of vengeance. When the dust settled, Taza dismounted. "You see now," he said to Gideon, "why I asked what I did. She cannot stay unprotected. The fire was only the beginning." Then he turned to his daughter. "You are not safe here. You are not safe anywhere unless he claims you." Nalnish's eyes flashed with pain. "Father, I cannot protect you forever," he said gently. "But he can, and he will if he chooses." Taza's voice softened. "You think you are cursed, but the spirits do not send curses. They send lessons. Perhaps he is yours. Perhaps you are his." The old man mounted his horse again. "You have until sunset," he said, his tone final. "After that, she must go." He rode away, leaving Gideon and Nalnish standing by the creek, surrounded by the sound of wind and water. The sun dipped lower, painting the world in amber light. Gideon looked at her, and for the first time he saw beyond the scars, beyond the fear. He saw the quiet strength of someone who had survived the unthinkable. He saw the courage it took to keep breathing in a world that had rejected her. And though he didn't yet understand it, his decision had already begun to form. Not from duty, but from something far deeper. The fire had taken only one night to change everything, but what grew from its ashes would take a lifetime to heal. The sun touched the horizon. In its last glow, Gideon knew that whatever came next would bind them in ways neither of them could yet name. The desert exhaled softly, as if approving, and somewhere far beyond the creek, the first stars began to bloom like quiet promises. The sun sank low behind the mesas, painting the valley in amber and rose, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. Gideon stood near the porch rail, the leather pouch still untouched, his fingers tracing its rough edges like a man reading a riddle written in sand. He had spent the entire day telling himself he owed her nothing, yet every heartbeat kept whispering the opposite. When the first shadows stretched across the field, he found his boots moving again toward the creek. The same path, the same wind whispering through tall grass, the same pull that had started the night of the fire. He didn't think about it anymore. He simply walked, because to stay still would have meant admitting how deeply she already lived inside his thoughts. Nalnish was still there, sitting in silence. The fading light turned her skin to bronze and her hair to dark silk. The water shimmered beside her like a sheet of glass, unbroken except where her reflection trembled. Gideon stopped a few feet away, the air between them filled with something unspoken, fragile, heavy, real. "You came back," she said without turning. "I didn't know where else to go," he replied. She nodded slightly, her eyes fixed on the water. "You shouldn't have come. The longer you stay, the harder it becomes to leave." "Maybe I don't want to leave." That made her turn. The look she gave him was unreadable, part confusion, part disbelief. "You don't know what that means. What I am." "I'm starting to," he said softly. Nalnish studied him, her gaze searching for lies, finding none. "Do you believe in curses, Gideon Pratt?" I believe people create them when they can't face what they fear. Her lips twitched, almost a smile, but there was no joy in it. My people think the spirits punished me before I even drew breath. They said I was born from shadow, too large, too strong, too unlike them. When I was a child, they tried to shrink me. When that failed, they tried to erase me. She held out her hands. These are the proof of their prayers. Gideon stepped closer, his gaze tracing the pale scars that mapped her palms and wrists, some deep, some faint, each a story of pain. He reached out, but stopped himself just before touching her. They did this to you? She nodded. The healers said the fire of pain could drive out the spirit that made me wrong, but all it did was teach me silence. The words cracked something open inside him. He'd known isolation, but not cruelty like that. His solitude had been chosen. Hers had been inflicted. You survived, he said quietly. Her eyes lifted to his, filled with the same defiance he'd seen when she faced the warriors. Survival isn't living. No, he admitted. But it's the beginning of it. A breeze swept over the creek, carrying the scent of rain from distant hills. For a moment they simply breathed in the quiet together. Nalnish spoke again, softer now. You should let me go before your life burns too. My father believes you can protect me, but he's wrong. They'll come again. The settlers, my people, everyone will want what they always wanted, my death. I've lived 15 years waiting for something to matter again, Gideon said, his voice steady but low. Maybe this is it. Her brow furrowed. You don't even know me. Then tell me who you are. I'm the story no one tells their children, she said. The lesson whispered around fires. Don't grow too strong. Don't dream too loud, or you'll become me. She took a long breath, her chest rising and falling like the rhythm of old grief. And you, Gideon Pratt, what are you? He looked at the horizon, where night was gathering. A man who once had a wife and child, a man who buried them and thought he buried himself with them, a man who built walls instead of a life, until last night. Her gaze softened, the anger fading into something gentler. You think saving me will save you? He shook his head. No. But maybe saving you is the first thing I've done that wasn't about myself. They stood in silence, bound by the honesty between them. Then the sound of wings. A raven, black as midnight, passed overhead, cawing once before disappearing into the distance. Nalnish followed it with her eyes. The spirits send signs, she murmured. Maybe that one's laughing at us. Maybe it's warning us, Gideon said. Or maybe it's blessing us, she countered. Even curses have their moments of mercy. Her words lingered like perfume on the air. The last sunlight touched her face, painting gold along her cheekbones, softening everything that had once seemed fearsome. For the first time, Gideon realized she wasn't terrifying because of her size. She was terrifying because of the strength it took to remain gentle in a world that had given her no reason to be. The sky deepened to indigo. Shadows thickened, and the creek began to hum with the chorus of night insects. Nalnish rose slowly, towering yet graceful, like a tree born of the earth itself. I'll leave before sunrise, she said. You won't make it far, he replied. Then I'll keep walking until I do. Gideon stepped closer. You won't have to. Her eyes narrowed. You're deciding for me? I'm deciding for myself, he said. I told your father I'd think until sunset. The sun's gone now." Her breath caught, a tremor running through her shoulders. "You can't bind yourself to a woman like me. You'll lose everything, your land, your peace, your place in this world. I already lost all that a long time ago." She shook her head, her voice cracking. "You don't understand. They'll come for you next. The settlers fear what they don't know, and the Apaches despise what they can't control. You'll be hated by both. Then I'll stand between them and you." The quiet that followed was deeper than words. The moon crept above the horizon, silvering the water and the grass. Gideon reached out, this time letting his hand rest against her wrist. Her skin was warm, her pulse steady beneath the roughness of scar. Nalnish didn't pull away. Her breath trembled. "No one's ever touched me without fear." "I'm afraid," he said softly. "Just not of you." She met his gaze, and for a heartbeat the world held its breath. Then she whispered, "If you do this, there's no turning back." He nodded. "Then we go forward." The sound of hoofbeats echoed again in the distance, soft at first, then sharper. Nalnish stiffened. "They're coming." Gideon looked toward the rising dust at the edge of the plains. Torches flickered, small flames moving in formation. "How many?" "Too many." He took her hand. "Then we'll face them together." The way she looked at him then, half disbelief, half reverence, made the air hum between them. Something broke open in her chest, something fragile and dangerous. Hope. They stood by the creek as the torches drew closer, their light painting the grass in trembling gold. Nalnish lifted her chin, unafraid. Gideon moved beside her, his stance calm and unyielding. But before the riders reached them, another sound rose from the west, the heavy gallop of a single horse moving fast. Taza emerged from the darkness, his expression fierce. "They are coming for her," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. "You have minutes, maybe less." "Then do it," Gideon said. Taza's eyes widened. "You've chosen?" "I have." Nalnish's voice broke, barely a whisper. "Gideon." He turned to her. "You said survival isn't living. Maybe this is how we start living." The old man dismounted, pulling a small bundle from his saddle. "We don't have time for ceremony," he said, arranging a few simple items on the ground. A cord, a feather, a stone, carved with a single mark. Just the binding. Nalnish's hands trembled. "You don't have to do this." "I already am," Gideon said. Taza's voice took on a rhythm like prayer. "In the eyes of earth and sky, two souls stand as one, not by choice alone, but by the fire that tested them." He looked between them. "Join your hands." Gideon reached for her. Nalnish hesitated, then placed her palm in his. Her hand dwarfed his, rough and scarred, but her touch was careful, as though she feared breaking him. Taza wrapped the cord around their joined hands once. "In this life and the next," the old man said, "what was two is now one." The wind carried the words away like smoke. Nalnish looked down at their hands, then back at Gideon, her breath unsteady. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I finally met something worth losing everything for." From the ridge came the glow of torches and the angry shouts of men. The earth vibrated beneath their boots. Gideon didn't move. He only tightened his fingers around hers. The night was about to burn again, but this time he wouldn't face it alone. And somewhere inside the storm of approaching light, amid fear and danger and the rising hum of fate, a seed of something impossible began to take root, something fragile, something healing, something like love. The night bled into chaos before the stars could even settle. The torches moved closer, the sound of hooves pounding against dry earth like war drums. The mob's voices rose with the wind, shouts twisted with fear, superstition, and the kind of hatred that always hides behind righteousness. Gideon stood at the center of it all, hand still bound to Nalnish's, feeling the heat of her skin, her pulse steady beneath his fingers. Around them, the air shimmered with tension thick enough to taste. Taza mounted his horse again, his eyes sharp and sorrowful. "They've come for her," he said, though everyone already knew. "You can still walk away, Gideon Pratt. Leave now, and they will not harm you." Gideon didn't move. "I told you my choice," he said. The old man studied him for a long moment, then gave a single nod, something ancient and resigned passing between them. "Then stand as one," he said quietly. "The spirits will remember." He spurred his horse toward the shadows, ready to meet the approaching crowd before it reached the creek. Nalnish turned to Gideon, her expression unreadable under the flickering torchlight. "You don't understand what you've done," she whispered. He looked at her, calm in a way that surprised even himself. "Maybe not, but I meant it." She wanted to argue, to tell him this wasn't salvation but a trap for them both. But before the words could leave her mouth, the first riders broke through the tree line. They came fast and loud, settlers with rifles and lanterns, faces drawn hard by fear and hunger for justice they didn't understand. One of them pointed. "There! That's the giant!" The name struck the night like a curse. Nalnish didn't flinch. She stood tall, her chin raised, the moon catching in her hair. Gideon stepped forward instinctively, shielding her, though he knew she needed no shield. "What do you want?" he called out, his voice carrying clear and steady across the open field. "The thing that burned the valley," a man shouted back. "The demon woman, we saw what she did, lifted a wagon with her bare hands. Unnatural strength like that don't come from God." Gideon felt Nalnish stiffen beside him, and then he understood. The rumors had already spread. The mother from the trading road must have spoken, and fear had done the rest. "She saved that child's life," he shouted back. "You'd be burying a boy today if not for her." "Maybe she saved him to claim him later," another voice called. "You don't know what kind of witchcraft that thing carries." Nalnish took a slow breath. The insults didn't sting anymore. They were echoes she'd lived with all her life. But Gideon's anger burned hotter than the torches before them. He stepped closer, voice like gravel. "You're standing on my land, and you're pointing weapons at my wife." The last word fell like thunder. The mob faltered, confusion flickering across their faces. "You're what?" someone spat. "My wife," he repeated louder. "You'll show her the respect due to that." A murmur rippled through the crowd, shock, disbelief, disgust. The farmer leading them, a broad man with sunburned skin and eyes gone cold from years of hate, dismounted with slow menace. "You married it?" he growled. "You brought that curse into your home?" "I brought a woman into my home," Gideon said. "A woman who suffered enough for a world too small to hold her." "Enough talking," someone shouted. "Step aside, Pratt. We'll handle this." "I'll bury the first man who takes another step," Gideon said quietly, and though he carried no gun, his tone had the kind of finality that silences fools. For a moment it worked. Then someone in the back fired a shot into the air, panic-shattering order. Horses reared, men shouted, and in the chaos one of the settlers raised his rifle toward Nalnish. She didn't wait. In a blur of motion, she reached for Gideon, pulling him behind her as the shot cracked through the night. The bullet struck her shoulder, but she didn't fall. She turned her head slowly toward the shooter, eyes burning with the quiet rage of someone who'd endured too much to fear anything left in this world. The man froze. Her expression wasn't violent. It was something far more terrifying. It was mercy restrained. "Enough!" a new voice boomed. From the eastern ridge came a single rider, moving with calm authority. The silver badge on his vest caught the torchlight like a star. The crowd parted instinctively as he approached. "Territorial Marshal," someone whispered. The rider dismounted, his boots crunching the dry dirt. "Name's Marshal Keene," he said evenly, looking over the scene. The rifles, the woman bleeding but standing tall, the rancher who refused to step back. "Now somebody want to tell me what the hell I'm looking at before I start arresting the lot of you?" The settlers started shouting over one another, accusations and half-truths blending into chaos. Keene raised a hand, and silence fell like a hammer. His gaze landed on Nalnish. "Ma'am, you hurt anyone tonight?" "No," she said, her voice steady despite the blood running down her arm. "But I will if I have to." The marshal nodded once, then turned to the crowd. "Any of you hurt? Any property burned? Any crime committed here tonight?" Uneasy glances passed among the men, but none spoke. "Didn't think so," Keene said. "What I do see is a dozen armed men trespassing on private land with intent to harm. You're lucky I don't haul you all into town for attempted murder." "She's not human," the farmer insisted. "She's a monster, Marshal. Being tall ain't a crime," Keene cut in. "Being different ain't either. You boys are the only monsters I see tonight." A tense silence followed. The mob's courage drained out of them like water from a cracked bucket. The marshal looked at Gideon next. "You said she's your wife. That true?" Gideon met his gaze without flinching. "It is." Keene turned to Taza, who had quietly reappeared behind them, his expression solemn. "Was there a witness to this marriage?" "I performed the binding myself," Taza said, "before the spirits and before men." "That'll hold under territorial law," Keene said. He faced the settlers again. "Then this woman's protected. Anyone touches her now. You're not just facing me, you're facing the law." The mob wavered, their hatred curdling into confusion and resentment. One by one, they began to back away. Keene's voice softened, but his eyes were steel. "Go home before I make good on that arrest threat." They left slowly, muttering under their breath, the firelight receding until only the wind remained. When the last rider disappeared into the dark, the marshal turned back to Gideon. "You know what you've done, son?" "Made a choice," Gideon said quietly. "You've made yourself an outcast," Keene replied. "Those men won't forget. You'll be welcome nowhere near this valley." "Then we'll go somewhere else." The marshal studied him for a moment, then gave a faint, approving nod. "Stubborn. Good. You'll need it." He turned to Nalnish. "You got lucky finding this one. Most men would have handed you over." Nalnish's voice trembled slightly, but her eyes stayed steady. "I know," Keen mounted his horse. "There's land further west, past the mineral claims. Good soil, no neighbors for miles. Try there. And if anyone bothers you again, send word my way." He rode off into the night, leaving dust and silence behind him. When he was gone, Taza stepped closer, his face lined with both pride and pain. "You have done what few men would," he said to Gideon, "and for that I owe you more than words." "You owe me nothing," Gideon said. "You trusted me with your daughter's life." Taza's voice cracked just slightly. "I failed her once. I won't fail her again. But this time I will let her choose her path, and she has chosen you." Nalnish turned away, blinking hard. "Father?" He lifted a hand gently. "No, my child. The fire was meant to destroy you, but it gave you something instead, a chance to begin again." He looked at Gideon. "See that she does." Taza mounted his horse, his silhouette framed by the fading glow of torches. "I will not see you again. But know this, you are no longer alone. Either of you." He rode away into the darkness, disappearing like a shadow swallowed by dawn. The air settled. The creek whispered again. The scent of smoke faded into the cool breath of night. Nalnish sank onto a nearby rock, pressing a hand against her wounded shoulder. Gideon knelt beside her, tearing a strip from his shirt to bind it. She didn't protest, only watched him in silence. His hands were steady, careful, his touch light as the breeze. "Does it hurt?" he asked. "I've felt worse," she said quietly, "but not this kind of pain." He looked up. "What kind?" "The kind that feels like staying." He didn't answer. He just tied the cloth tighter and met her gaze, steady and calm. The night around them softened, the air turning gentle, filled with the sound of water and wind, and something new growing in the space between them, something fragile, something warm. When he finished, she whispered, "Why did you stand in front of me?" He smiled faintly. "Because no one ever stood in front of me when they should have. I figured it was time someone broke that cycle." Her lips parted, but no words came. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, heavy with understanding, with the beginning of something unnamed. The stars brightened overhead. The wind brushed through the grass like a blessing. Gideon leaned back on his heels, his eyes meeting hers again. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we start packing." "Packing? We can't stay here, but we can build something new. Somewhere they won't find us." Nalnish looked at him for a long time, then nodded once. "You're serious?" "I've never been more so." The faintest smile touched her lips, a small, hesitant thing, like the first green shoot after a fire. "Then tomorrow," she said, "we build our tomorrow." Gideon exhaled, the weight in his chest loosening for the first time in years. The night, once filled with fear, now felt alive again. Alive with possibility, with healing, with the slow, miraculous warmth of two broken souls daring to believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd been found for a reason. The desert wind carried that feeling out across the valley, soft and endless, as the fire that once destroyed now made room for something new to grow. The dawn that followed the standoff came softer than any Gideon could remember. A fragile peace hung in the air, thin as morning mist over the pasture. The birds sang again, cautious but persistent, as though testing whether the world had survived the night. He stepped out onto the porch, boots brushing the wood worn smooth by years of solitude, and watched the light creep across the valley. The ground still bore the tracks of horses, the ghostly remains of fear, yet the wind smelled clean, smoke and blood washed away by time's slow mercy. Behind him, the door creaked open. Nalnish stepped out quietly, wrapped in a blanket that dwarfed even her. The wound on her shoulder had stiffened, but she stood tall, unflinching. The sun caught the bronze in her skin, lighting her from within like a statue that breathed. Gideon turned slightly, just enough to see her face. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Neither did you." They both knew rest had become a luxury they could not afford. Yet the silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was companionable, like two souls who no longer needed words to understand one another. The fire had bound them more tightly than any ceremony. As the sun rose higher, Gideon began preparing the horses. Nalnish watched him from the porch, her dark eyes tracing the methodical grace in every movement, the quiet patience of a man who had learned to survive through rhythm and routine. She wondered how many mornings he had spent like this, alone with the land, letting its stillness fill the space where laughter and love should have been. He tied down the saddlebags, checked the canteens, then looked up at her. "We'll need to move by afternoon. The marshal was right. There'll be talk." And talk turns to action when fear grows. Nalnish nodded, though her chest tightened with something she didn't yet have words for. Leaving was survival, but it also meant abandoning what little normalcy she'd found. The creek, the scent of mesquite, the place where she'd finally been seen without judgment. Still, she knew he was right. Staying would only invite another kind of fire. Inside, the small cabin smelled of coffee and dust. She moved slowly, collecting what few items she owned, nothing of weight, just pieces of a life spent in hiding. Her father's old amulet, a carved stone feather, lay on the table. She ran her fingers over its surface, feeling the faint grooves worn by time and tears. When she looked up, Gideon stood in the doorway watching her. "You can take that," he said softly. "It's from another life." "Maybe," he said, "but it made you who you are. Don't leave it behind." She slipped it into her satchel, the leather creaking as if sighing. Their eyes met, and in that simple exchange, something shifted. A quiet acknowledgement that this wasn't just survival anymore. It was beginning. By noon, they were ready. The ranch house stood stripped of memory, emptied of the ghosts that had once kept Gideon company. He looked around one last time, the place where he'd buried years in silence. "Any regrets?" Nalnish asked. He shook his head. "Only that I didn't leave sooner." They rode out together, their shadows stretching long across the desert floor. The rhythm of hooves against dust was steady, almost soothing. The land opened wide around them, gold and endless. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was the first breath of it. For hours they said little, but silence between them had changed. It was no longer a wall, it was a bridge. Gideon caught himself glancing toward her more often than he meant to, watching the way her hair moved in the wind, the quiet strength in her posture. She rode as if she belonged to the earth, each motion effortless, unbroken. When the sun began to dip, they stopped near a dry ravine. Gideon built a small fire, careful to shield it from view with stones. Nalnish gathered twigs and branches, her movements precise and economical. There was grace even in her smallest gestures, as though each action was a prayer to the world that had once cursed her. When they sat by the fire, she spoke first. "You should have let me go." He didn't look up from the flames. "Maybe. But I didn't." "Why?" "Because every time I've let someone go, I've lost a piece of myself with them. I'm tired of losing." She studied him, the flicker of firelight painting his features in gold and shadow. There was no arrogance in his words, only truth, heavy and healing. She wanted to tell him how dangerous that truth was, for both of them, but the words refused to form. Instead, she asked, "What will we do when we reach the West?" "Build a home," he said simply. "Nothing grand, just something ours." She almost smiled. "A home? I don't think I've ever had one." "You will," Gideon said, his voice warm and steady. "You already do." The quiet that followed was thick with emotion neither dared to name. The stars blinked awake above them, 1,000 eyes watching their fragile peace unfold. The night felt alive, alive with newness, with hope disguised as exhaustion. Later, when the fire had burned down to embers, Nalnish lay on her side, facing the glow. Gideon sat nearby, unable to sleep. He watched her, the rise and fall of her breath, the faint lines of pain softened by rest. She was unlike anyone he'd ever known. Stronger than most men he'd ridden beside, yet there was a tenderness in her that no cruelty had managed to destroy. He thought about what her father had said, that she was born too large, too different, too strong. But Gideon didn't see monstrosity. He saw survival carved into every muscle, every scar. He saw a woman who had refused to die simply because others decided she should. When she stirred in her sleep, her brow creased slightly, as if haunted by ghosts even dreams couldn't chase away. Gideon reached for a blanket and covered her shoulders. Her body relaxed, and the smallest sigh escaped her lips. It was a quiet thing, caring for her. But it filled him in ways he hadn't known he was empty. Morning found them riding again, the land transforming with every mile. The mesas gave way to gentler hills dotted with juniper and sage. A river glimmered faintly in the distance, silver as a mirror under the rising sun. They crossed it by mid-afternoon, the cold water splashing against their boots. Nalnish laughed softly when Gideon nearly lost his balance. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, a low, melodic sound, shy but alive. He turned toward her, smiling despite himself. "That's the first time I've heard you sound like a person who believes she might live." She blinked, startled by his tenderness. "Maybe I'm starting to." Her laughter lingered in the air like a bell that refused to fade. By evening, they reached a stretch of valley where the grass grew taller and the soil darkened with promise. Gideon dismounted, running his hand through the dirt. It crumbled easily between his fingers. "Good land," he murmured. "Rich enough to grow something." Nalnish dismounted too, her boots sinking slightly into the earth. "You think this is the place?" He looked up, the sunset blazing behind her. "I think this is the start." She knelt beside him, her massive hand resting gently over his. "Then we start here." They worked in silence as the last light faded, clearing brush, marking space for what would become walls. The act of building, even in its smallest form, carried its own healing rhythm. Each strike of Gideon's shovel, each lift of her arm, carved their defiance into the land. When night returned, they stood side by side before the first post they'd set into the ground. It wasn't much, a single piece of wood, leaning slightly under its own weight, but it was real. Gideon turned to her. "You know, it'll take months to finish." She smiled faintly. "We've got time." The wind moved gently through the valley, carrying the scent of sage and the quiet sound of two hearts finding rhythm again. Later, when they sat by their small fire under the endless western sky, Nalnish looked at him and said softly, "No one's ever built anything with me before." He looked back, eyes soft. "Then this will be the first of many." She stared into the fire, the glow reflected in her dark eyes. "Do you ever think about what they'll say about us? The stories they'll tell?" "Let them talk," Gideon said. "Stories die in the mouths of cowards. But this—" He gestured to the fire, the land, the stars. "This will live." She breathed in deeply, the air filling her chest like a promise. "Then let it live." The fire crackled, sending sparks into the sky like fragments of something sacred. He reached for her hand, and for the first time she didn't hesitate. Her fingers folded around his, rough against rough, strong against steady. It wasn't passion that bound them. Not yet. It was something quieter, older, something like belonging. The kind that grows slow, steady, inevitable. The kind that heals without trying. The stars turned overhead, endless and watching, as two souls who had been broken by the world began to build one of their own, plank by plank, heartbeat by heartbeat, until the darkness no longer felt like an ending, but the beginning of something vast and tender, something that might one day be called love. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind of peace that feels borrowed, too fragile to last. The valley embraced them slowly, as if testing whether they belonged. Mornings began with the soft hum of wind moving through wild sage and the rhythmic scrape of tools against earth. Gideon rose first, as always, coaxing fire from the ashes before dawn, and Nalnish followed soon after, silent but alert, her presence filling the small clearing like sunlight through fog. Their cabin grew plank by plank, a modest skeleton of rough pine that smelled of sap and beginnings. Gideon worked with practiced hands, his movements deliberate, each swing of the hammer measured by years of solitude that had taught him patience. Nalnish carried logs that would have broken another person's back without complaint, her strength no longer something she hid, but something she used, not in anger, but in service to the life they were building. When she worked, Gideon sometimes found himself watching her, the way her muscles moved under bronze skin, the calm focus in her eyes, the rare curve of her mouth when she caught him staring. There was nothing fragile about her, and yet there was a gentleness in the way she placed each beam, careful, almost reverent. She was building something sacred, not just shelter, but belonging. At night, they sat by the fire outside, too tired to speak much. The stars here seemed brighter, scattered like silver seeds across the heavens. Nalnish would tilt her head back, gaze distant. "When I was a child," she said one evening, "I used to think the stars were holes in the blanket of the sky, places where the spirits peeked through to remind us they were still watching." Gideon smiled faintly, his voice low and rough. "You still think that?" She shrugged. Maybe some spirits, just like the view." The simplicity of it warmed him. In another life he would have laughed easily. Now he only nodded, feeling something wordless bloom in his chest. As the cabin walls rose, so did the quiet between them, comfortable, filled with small acts of care. Gideon cooked when he could, though Nalnish's patience with his efforts amused her endlessly. Once, when his bread came out flat and burned at the edges, she tore a piece, tasted it, and said simply, "Still better than what I used to eat." "Don't lie to make me feel better," he said. She met his eyes. "I don't lie, especially not to the man building my home." Something unspoken passed between them then, something steady and fragile. For the first time, Gideon realized he no longer felt like a man protecting her. He felt like a man standing beside her. Equal, chosen. Weeks slipped into months. The cabin took shape, its roof slanting low against the western wind. The valley, once harsh and lonely, began to soften. They planted a small patch of crops near the creek, corn, beans, squash, seeds traded from a trapper who'd wandered too far from town. Gideon watched Nalnish work the soil with her bare hands, her touch surprisingly tender. "You treat the earth like it's alive," he said. "It is alive," she answered simply. "It listens." That night, the wind howled across the plains, carrying with it the chill of early winter. Inside, the new cabin still smelled of fresh wood and smoke. The hearth glowed faintly. Nalnish sat on the floor near the fire, brushing her long hair, her scarred hands moving slowly through its dark strands. Gideon watched her from the table, the faint flicker of the flames painting her face in warm light. Her eyes caught his, and for a moment neither looked away. There was a question in her gaze, a fragile, frightened thing, but he didn't speak. Words felt clumsy in the face of something so delicate. "I never thanked you," she said softly. "For what?" "For not running." He smiled faintly. "I've done enough running for one lifetime." Her expression softened. "You could have left me that night. The fire, the mob, even my father's request. No one would have blamed you." "I would have blamed me," he said. The fire popped, sending up sparks that drifted like tiny stars. Nalnish turned her face toward the flames, her profile calm and strong. "My people believed I was born wrong," she murmured. "But sometimes I think I was just born for a different world. Maybe I was waiting for this one." Her words lingered in the air like incense. Gideon stood and crossed the small space between them, lowering himself to sit beside her. The warmth of the fire touched both their faces. "Maybe," he said, his voice a whisper. "Maybe we were both waiting." For a long time they didn't move. The firelight danced, the wind sighed through the cracks, and outside the night pressed close but not unwelcome. Nalnish's shoulder brushed his arm, a soft contact that felt more intimate than any embrace. In the days that followed, their lives unfolded in quiet partnership. Gideon hunted while Nalnish tended the land. When storms came, they sat inside by the window, listening to the rain drum against the roof they had built together. Sometimes she would hum, a low melodic sound, ancient and wordless. Gideon never asked what it meant. He only listened, letting the sound wrap around him like a balm. One morning, after a long night of thunder, Gideon found Nalnish outside near the creek. The sky had cleared, and mist rose from the wet grass. She was kneeling beside a small patch of wildflowers, her massive hands cupping their fragile stems. The sight struck him, the paradox of her strength and gentleness. "They survived the storm," he said quietly. "They always do," she replied. "The roots know how to hold on." He knelt beside her, the damp earth seeping through his knees. "You remind me of them," he said. She looked up sharply, unsure whether to believe him. "Flowers?" "Not the petals," he said. "The roots." For the first time, she smiled fully, an unguarded, radiant thing that softened every scar, every shadow. "You're learning how to speak like someone who listens," she said. "And you," he replied gently, "are learning how to stay." Their eyes met, and in that moment, the quiet between them wasn't silence at all. It was language. By the time winter settled in, the valley had transformed. Snow dusted the edges of the hills, and smoke curled from the cabin's chimney like a promise. Gideon built traps for game. Nalnish mended clothing, her large fingers surprisingly nimble. They shared everything: work, laughter, silence, warmth. One night, when the cold outside was sharp enough to freeze the stars, Nalnish sat beside the hearth, the fire's glow tracing her cheekbones. Gideon leaned against the wall nearby, polishing his old rifle. "Do you miss them?" he asked quietly. "My people?" She nodded slowly. "Sometimes. I miss the songs, the smell of cedar smoke, but not the fear." Her voice softened. "Do you miss yours?" "Every day," he admitted, "but the memories hurt less here. Maybe because I finally have someone to share the quiet with." Nalnish turned toward him then, her eyes shimmering in the firelight. "You speak like a man who's healing." He set the rifle aside. "Maybe I am." Outside, snow began to fall again, slow and soft. Inside, warmth gathered in the small room like light. Gideon reached across the space between them, his hand brushing hers. She didn't pull away. Her skin was warm, her fingers calloused but steady. "Gideon," she said quietly, "if I scare you, tell me now." "You don't scare me," he said. "You make me remember what it means to feel alive." Her breath caught, trembling slightly. The fire hissed, a soft exhale. She leaned closer, her forehead resting gently against his. The contact was brief, tender, fragile, like touching something sacred for the first time. Neither spoke. The silence was enough. When she finally pulled back, there were tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of release. "I've never been allowed to touch without fear," she whispered. "Then let this be the first time," he said. Outside, the snow fell thicker, muting the world in white. Inside, they sat together by the fire, their shadows merging against the wall. The night held them like a secret, and for the first time since the fire that had brought them together, neither of them felt alone. The cabin crackled, the flames steady. Gideon felt her head rest lightly against his shoulder, and he closed his eyes. Her breathing matched his, slow and even, 2 heartbeats finding rhythm in the same quiet. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether the world beyond their valley would ever forgive them, but for now the present was enough. The warmth of her beside him, the fire's glow, the wind's gentle hum, all of it whispered the same truth, that healing didn't always come through miracles, but through moments. And sometimes the most broken people found each other not to fix one another, but to remember that they were never unworthy of love in the first place. Outside, the snow fell like feathers from a forgiving sky. Inside, their hands remained joined, steady and certain, as the night folded around them, soft, quiet, eternal. Spring crept into the valley like a slow exhale after a long-held breath. The snow melted first from the ridges, dripping in silver threads down into the grasslands, and the soil, dark and rich, began to breathe again. Days grew longer, warmer. Birds returned in flocks, their songs drifting through the still mornings. Gideon woke to their music and to the sound of Nalnish moving about the cabin. Soft footsteps, careful movements, the gentle rhythm of someone who had learned how to live without disturbing peace. Their home was small, but alive now. Vines began to curl around the posts outside, green tendrils exploring what they'd built. The crops they planted had begun to sprout, fragile leaves reaching toward the sun. Gideon spent his mornings repairing fences or tending to their horses, while Nalnish walked the edges of the creek, her long shadow trailing behind her like memory. There was an ease between them that hadn't existed before. It was not the loud kind of happiness, but the quiet one, the kind that grows softly, unnoticed, until it fills every empty corner. Sometimes Gideon would look up from his work and find Nalnish watching him, her expression unreadable but warm. Other times it was he who watched her, tracing the graceful precision in her every movement, the way her presence carried calm instead of fear now. The scars on her hands had faded to silver, and though they would never vanish, they looked different in sunlight. Less like wounds, more like maps of where she had survived. One afternoon, while fixing a wooden beam on the porch, Gideon heard her humming again. It was a tune unlike anything he knew. Low, ancient, and tender, like a song carried through generations of women who had prayed beneath open skies. When she noticed him listening, she smiled faintly. "My mother used to hum that when I couldn't sleep," she said. "I haven't sung it since she died." He lowered his hammer. "It's beautiful. You should keep singing." Her eyes softened. "I thought silence was safer." "Maybe once," he said, "but not anymore." The moment hung between them, gentle and golden. Nalnish began humming again, and this time Gideon joined her, not with words, just with the steady rhythm of his hammer tapping softly in time. The sound of creation mixed with the melody of memory, and for a while the world felt perfectly whole. Evenings brought their own kind of stillness. They would sit outside by the fire pit, sharing simple meals, beans, bread, roasted meat. Nalnish had learned to cook by scent and touch, seasoning food with wild herbs she gathered from the valley. Gideon often watched her hands move with the confidence of someone who no longer doubted her place in the world. Once, as they ate beneath a sky thick with stars, she looked up and asked quietly, "Do you think people ever truly stop running from their past?" He took a long breath, watching the flames twist between them. "I don't think it's about stopping," he said. "It's about finding something stronger to run toward." She nodded slowly, her gaze lost in the fire. "Then maybe this is what I've been running toward." He smiled, a small, tired smile that held a lifetime in it. "Maybe it is." The following days unfolded like gentle waves. Gideon repaired the barn roof. Nalnish built a loom from fallen branches and began weaving cloth from plant fibers. The cabin filled with the scent of wood smoke and wildflowers. When rain came, they sat inside, listening to it drum against the roof, while Nalnish told him stories, tales of her people, of spirits who lived in rivers and trees, of warriors who turned into eagles at dusk. Gideon listened as if the world depended on every word. Sometimes she laughed, and when she did, it changed the air. It was on one of those rain-soaked evenings that the thunder rolled too close. Nalnish flinched. It wasn't the sound. It was the smell. The smoke of burning wood carried faintly by the storm. Her hands froze where they rested on the table. Gideon noticed. He moved closer, his voice soft. "It's only the rain," he said, as if the words themselves could keep the past at bay. But she was trembling. Memories flickered across her face. The cabin aflame, the sound of crackling timbers, her own screams swallowed by fire. Gideon reached out, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she needed to. She didn't. His hand closed over hers, steady, warm. "It's not the same fire," he whispered. "This one keeps us alive." Her breath came unevenly, but she nodded. "Sometimes I still smell the old one," she said, "even when it's not there." "I know." His thumb brushed the back of her hand. "I smell mine too." The storm passed, leaving the world washed and new. The next morning she rose before him, walked barefoot through the wet grass, and stood in the sunlight until her fear melted into warmth again. Gideon watched her from the porch, feeling something deep in his chest loosen. Admiration, yes, but also tenderness that ran bone deep. Weeks passed. The valley bloomed in wild color, violet lupine, gold poppies, red earth warmed by sun. The air tasted of life. They began to smile more easily, laugh more freely. Once, Nalnish tripped while carrying a bucket of water, soaking herself from shoulder to waist. Gideon tried not to laugh, failed completely, and soon she was laughing too, loud and full, the kind of laughter that shakes the soul awake. It startled the horses, but Gideon thought it was the most healing sound he'd ever heard. Later that evening, she stood by the creek, still smiling faintly. "I used to think joy was dangerous," she said, "that it invited punishment." "Maybe joy is the punishment," Gideon said, his voice quiet but sure. "For all the years we didn't believe we deserved it." Nalnish turned to him, and for the first time her eyes didn't hold fear or shame. They held peace. They began to speak of the future, not in grand plans, but in small, tender hopes. Gideon talked about building a second cabin someday, for storage or maybe for guests. Nalnish said she wanted a garden big enough to feed anyone who might wander hungry to their door. They didn't call it a dream. It was simply what came next. One night, when the valley lay under a blanket of moonlight, Nalnish woke to the sound of Gideon murmuring in his sleep. He was turned toward her, his face unguarded, younger somehow in the glow of the dying fire. She reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers trembling slightly. He stirred but didn't wake. For years she had feared her own hands, believing they only brought pain, but here, touching him, they felt like instruments of grace. She leaned down and pressed her lips to his forehead, a silent prayer, a promise. The warmth of him beneath her hand made something ache inside her, something she hadn't dared to feel in a lifetime. The next morning he found her outside, standing by the corral, watching the sun rise. She turned when he approached, her expression unreadable. "You talk in your sleep," she said. "Bad habit," he replied. "What did I say?" She looked down, smiling faintly. "You said my name." He froze, caught off guard by how intimate the revelation felt. "Was I yelling it?" "No," she said softly. "You said it like someone remembering home." He didn't answer. He just reached for her hand, and she let him take it. Their fingers intertwined naturally now, like it had been that way all along. The days warmed, and the valley grew green again. One evening, as they worked in the garden, a stranger appeared at the edge of the clearing, a trapper on horseback, lost or curious. Gideon tensed, but Nalnish simply stood tall, meeting the man's gaze without flinching. Her presence was commanding, but calm. The trapper tipped his hat, muttered a greeting, and rode on. When he was gone, Gideon let out the breath he'd been holding. Nalnish smiled faintly. "Not everyone who finds us means harm," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but I'm not taking chances." "You don't have to. The land protects its own." Her words proved true. The valley seemed to hold them in a quiet embrace, untouched by the world's noise. Seasons turned, their lives unfolding like chapters written in the soil. And though danger still lingered somewhere far away, they had learned something stronger than fear, the art of peace. That night, they stood outside, watching the stars. Gideon wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and she leaned against him, her head resting beneath his chin. "Do you ever think the world will forgive us?" she asked. He smiled. "Maybe it already has. Maybe this is what forgiveness looks like." Nalnish closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and rain. "Then maybe I can forgive myself too." "You already have," he said, his arm tightening around her. The night air was cool, the stars infinite, the silence healing. Beneath them, the cabin stood strong, its walls humming with the soft memory of laughter and whispered prayers. And though neither said the word aloud, love had already settled between them, quiet, patient, and steady as the earth beneath their feet. It was not the fiery kind that burned away reason, but the kind that mended, the kind that made broken souls whole again. As the wind moved gently through the valley, Gideon realized that sometimes love didn't announce itself in grand declarations or desperate touches. Sometimes it arrived like this, softly, faithfully, in the space between breaths. And in that stillness, beneath the vast, forgiving sky, they both understood that the lives they'd fled from had not ended in tragedy. They had simply been waiting to begin. The year turned quietly, marked not by calendars or clocks, but by the way the light changed on the hills. Summer arrived with the scent of blooming sage and the hum of bees drifting through open windows. The land was no longer wild and unfamiliar. It had grown around them, and they within it. Their cabin had aged into the valley's rhythm, wood darkened by sun and rain, its walls filled with laughter and the warmth of two souls learning how to belong. Gideon woke each morning before the sun rose, his body attuned to the stillness before light. The first sound he always heard was Nalnish's breathing beside him, deep, steady, peaceful. It was a sound he had come to depend on, more comforting than any prayer he'd ever known. He would sit for a moment, watching her. The firelight would touch her skin like a benediction, and he would marvel again at how a life once built on loneliness had become something gentle, something whole. Outside, the world shimmered. Dew glistened on the grass, and the sky blushed faintly at the edges. Gideon would feed the horses, fetch water from the creek, and return to find Nalnish already awake, tending to their garden. She moved with purpose, strong and sure, her dark hair tied back, her scars catching the morning light like silver threads. She greeted each plant as though it were a friend, whispering to the leaves, touching the soil with reverence. It was an old ritual, born of her people, and Gideon never interrupted it. He simply watched, feeling his chest swell with a quiet awe that words could not name. Sometimes he helped her, and sometimes he didn't, because love, he'd learned, wasn't always about doing. Sometimes it was about standing nearby and letting someone's peace exist untouched. Nalnish had once feared her own hands, but now those same hands coaxed life from the ground. Gideon thought that was the purest kind of healing, not forgetting the past, but transforming it into something that could grow. Their days passed in steady harmony. They built a smokehouse for meat, expanded the barn, and gathered wild honey from the cliffs. Nalnish carved small totems from wood in her spare hours, tiny figures of eagles, wolves, and women with open hands. She said they kept bad dreams away. Gideon never questioned it. He'd hung one above the doorway, and he swore the nights felt softer since. In the evenings, they often sat by the creek as the sun bled red across the horizon. The air would cool, cicadas humming in the distance. Gideon would lean back against a rock, his hands folded behind his head, and watch Nalnish dip her feet into the water. Her laughter came easier now, lighter, unburdened. Sometimes she told him stories, tales of sky spirits and wandering stars, of love that crossed rivers and time. Once, after one of those stories, she looked at him and said, "My father used to say that love isn't a fire, it's a seed. You plant it, you guard it, and if you're patient, one day you'll wake up living inside the tree it became." Gideon smiled faintly. "Then I think we've been growing one hell of a tree." She laughed, shaking her head. "A stubborn one. It took root in stone." "Those are the ones that last," he said softly. The seasons turned again. Autumn arrived with golden light and the hush of migrating birds. They harvested what the earth had given, corn, beans, herbs, and dried them for winter. Nalnish wove blankets from coarse thread, humming while she worked. Gideon hunted when needed, his rifle slung across his shoulder, though he often returned with more stories than game. He'd met traders and travellers, some curious, some wary. None stayed long. Word had spread about the giant Apache woman who lived with the white rancher in the western hills. Some came to see if she was real, others to see if she was dangerous. All left changed. The first time a group of settlers arrived with supplies instead of weapons, Nalnish had stared in disbelief. A woman with a wagon of fabrics and sugar had greeted her kindly, thanking her for the herbs she'd traded through travellers the season before. Nalnish's eyes had filled with tears she didn't let fall. Later, she told Gideon, "It's strange. I used to dream of being unseen. Now, kindness makes me afraid." He had touched her hand then. "That's how healing feels at first. It's heavy because you're not used to carrying light." The days grew shorter. Nights came earlier, thick with stars. Inside their cabin, the fire burned steady, painting their walls with gold. They shared their space easily now, as if they'd been doing it their entire lives. Sometimes Nalnish would sit by the hearth, her long legs tucked beneath her, mending clothes, while Gideon read aloud from an old, worn book. He wasn't much of a reader, but his voice was deep and soothing, and Nalnish liked to close her eyes and just listen. Once, during one of those quiet nights, she said softly, "I never thought peace would sound like this." He looked up. "Like what?" "Like wood crackling, like your voice reading words I don't need to understand, like a roof that doesn't leak." He smiled, setting the book down. "That's what home sounds like." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and the rest of the night passed in contented silence. Winter came again, but it no longer carried the weight of fear. The snow outside was a blanket, not a barrier. They had enough food, enough warmth, enough love to carry them through. Nalnish sometimes stepped outside at dawn to let the snow fall on her face. Gideon would stand at the doorway, watching her, thinking she looked like a living piece of the sky, strong, radiant, untamed. One night, as the snow whispered against the windows, she asked quietly, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't seen the fire that night?" He thought for a long moment. "Then maybe the fire would have found me anyway. Maybe that's how it works. Some souls are meant to meet through the flames." She turned toward him, her eyes glimmering in the light. "And you're not sorry?" "Not for a single breath," he said. She smiled then, slow and genuine. And in that moment he knew that every wound, every lonely year had led him here, to this cabin, this life, this woman. They sat close as the fire crackled, their shadows dancing together against the walls. Gideon reached for her hand, and she laced her fingers through his, without hesitation. The years of distance between them, the fear, the silence, the mistrust, had all burned away, leaving only something true. Outside, the storm deepened. Inside, warmth bloomed. Nalnish rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, steady, strong, human. "You once said you didn't know how to be married," she murmured. "I'm learning," he said. "So am I." They fell quiet again. The fire dimmed, but never died, and in that soft, flickering light they found what the world had always denied them: rest. When spring returned once more, the valley was theirs. Flowers spread across the fields like spilled paint. The garden flourished, the creek ran full, and their laughter carried far beyond the hills. They didn't speak of forever. They didn't need to. Each sunrise was enough. Sometimes travelers passed their way, wanderers, outcasts, people searching for something they couldn't name. Gideon always offered water, food, and rest. Nalnish, once the woman the world tried to erase, now offered comfort to those who feared they had no place. Some called her the woman of the healing valley. Others whispered she was a spirit of the land. She only smiled when she heard that. At night, when the fire burned low, Gideon would sit beside her, both of them looking out at the dark fields, breathing beneath the stars. The air would hum with the sound of crickets, the whisper of water, and the pulse of life continuing quietly, faithfully. He would take her hand, feel the warmth of her fingers against his, and say softly, "We made it." And Nalnish, looking at the world they'd built, the peace they'd sown from ashes, would answer, "No, Gideon, we're still making it." every day. They stayed like that often, two silhouettes against the light, unremarkable to anyone passing by, but to the earth they were something sacred. A reminder that love doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, patiently, until even the broken learn to listen. And if you listen now, if you close your eyes and breathe deeply, maybe you can still feel it. The warmth of their fire, the soft wind across the grass, the rhythm of two hearts that refused to give up. If this story touched something inside you, let your heart speak back. Leave a thought, a feeling, a whisper in the comments below. And if you want more stories that heal, that remind you love is still out there waiting, remember to like, subscribe, and stay with us, because somewhere, just beyond the noise, another quiet love is waiting to be told.